speaking for myself, that can be challenging because every surgeon has a different way of doing things. And, Dr. So-and-so comes in and he's so laxed and you enjoy his room and it's so easy to not do the timeout the same you would in another surgeon's room. So keep it consistent to keep it accurate.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
This week on First Case, we speak with Brenna Page. She's a nurse with 20 years healthcare experience, and 13 of those years have been spent in the operating room. She has a master's in nursing leadership and healthcare education, and she's CNOR certified and a recent recipient of the new certification for ambulatory surgical nurse. She has experience as an OR supervisor, charge nurse, and circulator in both hospital and outpatient surgery settings. Most of her time has been spent in orthopedics in the surgery center. She's currently located in the Denver, Colorado area and working in a surgery center per diem. Melanie, this is somebody, and you've just done such a great job of finding guests from your Circulating Life Facebook page, and this is another one. And I'm really excited to talk about our topic today of timeouts from somebody who's really out there on the front lines and living with it every day, and somebody who has probably seen a wide variety of consistency or practices and cultures related to timeouts.
Brenna was somebody who really stood out to me on the Circulating Life page because her comments really just let me know that she really knew what she was doing, that she seemed very competent, and she had a lot of passion, even that came through in her comments. And so I do pay attention to the comments on the Circulating Lives page. And she was somebody I wanted to talk to and reach out to. And when I talked to her about the topic, it was just, she had that passion for the timeout and how important it was. And I knew that she would be somebody that we wanted to talk to about it. And I'm really looking forward to diving into that more with her and really exploring the timeout process and all of the ways that we are trying to ensure our patient safety through this.
Yeah, in her bio, I heard loud and clear, nursing leadership and healthcare education. And I'm sure that theme is going to play out in her perspective as we speak with her today. So we're going to be right back after a short break with Brenna Page.
You're listening to the First Case podcast.
Joining us now is Brenna Page, currently working in a surgery center in the Denver area. Brenna, thank you so much for joining us to talk about timeouts today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is fantastic.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you. We've been looking at a number of different topics to discuss in the early episodes of the First Case podcast, and timeouts was one of the ones that really stood out to everybody on the team. But before we get started, can you just talk a little bit about your passion for perioperative services and maybe your experiences that led to that?
Well, I have been in the OR for 13 years. And as I went through nursing school, I was really discouraged because I couldn't find anything I wanted to do. And it was that day that I spent in the operating room. It was aortic valve replacement. And bingo, I knew that the OR was where I needed to be.
That's a great story, and it's not an uncommon one. I remember my senior year in nursing thinking, I just spent all this time going to school, and I'm not really sure exactly what area I want to go into, but I'm glad you found your calling and that you would enjoy it so much. Let's talk about timeouts then. We're going to dive pretty deep into this, but set the table for us and talking about why you think timeouts are so important?
Oh, wow. Well, they continue to be an issue even today, ever since the Joint Commission went ahead and released their universal protocol in 2004. But even today, we're still having wrong site, wrong side, and wrong patient surgeries. So still what we're doing today requires improvements, but it's definitely helping. The timeout is absolutely essential before anything touches that patient in the operating room. We need to make sure we've got the correct patient in there, that we've got the correct procedure, and ensuring their safety is our top priority.
When we're talking about how important our timeout is and just what we need to have, can you talk a little bit about everything that's really supposed to be included in a timeout? What makes our timeout process specific, I guess, or what's important to it to make sure we include, to make sure that we're taking care of that patient properly?
Oh, sure. Yeah, and if I could just take one step back from that question, Melanie.
Sure.
In 2008, the World Health Organization released their surgical safety checklist. And coincidentally, that was the year that I went into the OR. So I have never been a circulator without that safety checklist. The safety checklist has 3 components to it. So we are doing a pre-procedure verification. We're doing that timeout right before incision is made in the OR. And then we're doing another verification process before the patient leaves the OR. And for the most part, it can be facility-based as to what you include in it, but there's a central core of elements that have to be involved in the timeout to ensure the patient's safety.
So, Brenna, I travel all over the country and I see variations of timeouts from the time that they're done to the participants involved. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important, the timing? You mentioned the 3 phases of the World Health Organization surgical safety checklist, why it's important that those occur when they occur, and who should be involved in those timeouts.
Okay. For the pre-procedure verification, that usually takes place in your pre-op holding area. You want to make sure that you've got the correct patient back there before you do anything. That'll start with 2 patient identifiers, and you'll have the patient participation there. They'll confirm the correct site and procedure, and then that's where we also make sure we've got updated H&Ps, the consent forms are taken care of, all the orders are fulfilled. We can touch back on this later, but that's also where the nerve blocks would be administered in most places. Then in the OR, that timeout, it can occur, again, it's facility-based. Most often I have seen the timeouts occur right before the scalpel is given to the surgeon. So the patient is already anesthetized and draped, and we'll do the timeout. But there's also been instances where we'll have patient participation with a surgeon-led timeout where the surgeon will come into the room before the patient is given any type of sedation, and then everybody there will participate. And for varying different reasons, those could be successful. Just depends on the facility. Right before incision, right before that scalpel is handed off, we want to make sure that all team members are present. Doesn't do a lot of good if we're missing anybody. We need to make sure that every person on that team is present and on the same page. We need 2 patient identifiers, in some cases visual of an armband, not always. Confirmation from all members on correct patient, site, and procedure. You can compare that with the consent form. Verification of the site mark or the armband, correct positioning, implants, special equipment, imaging. In some cases, a vendor has to be present, not in all cases, but you can include that. Confirmation of sterility, blood products. Is your patient type and screened, type and crossed? Are there units available? Antibiotic administration. We all know that they have to be initiated 60 minutes prior to incision. The timeout has to be documented in real time, and a second timeout occurs if a second surgeon comes in or if a second procedure is performed.
So when you talk about I want to go back just a little bit. You mentioned very briefly the nerve blocks occurring. There are facilities that consider any type of procedure, invasive procedure being done on a patient, that a timeout should occur. What's your thoughts on that? Should we be doing a formal timeout when we're doing regional anesthesia blocks there in pre-op, or is that pre-evaluation enough to confirm prior to that regional anesthetic being administered?
I agree wholeheartedly that a timeout needs to be performed before that nerve block is administered. Unfortunately, in my career, I have seen 4 instances, different facilities, but 4 instances where the wrong limb was given the nerve block. So that's an absolute must. And whether it's the anesthesiologist and an OR nurse or the anesthesiologist and a pre-op nurse, time has to be taken to do a timeout.
What about like documentation or like a checklist or a whiteboard, like everything that you just talked about, all the elements of a proper timeout? Like, how do you make sure that you're consistent with that process? Like, you just rattled off a whole bunch, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure for a lot of people, it starts feeling like second nature, but it's almost like you get, I don't want to say lulled into complacency, because I don't want to say people are complacent, but you get lulled into a routine, and that's often when mistakes do get made. So how do you kind of have that checks and balances in place?
Yeah, and that's absolutely correct. It's very easy to let that happen. Most often I have seen the checklist format, and the circulator will stand there and read off each and check off as they're being read. There's also the computerized version where they'll be standing at the computer in real time and clicking as they're reading down the checklist. But it is up to the person, most often the circulator, that's handling the timeout to make sure that nothing is missed. They've got to be paying attention.
Yeah, when I started at my current facility, our timeouts were anesthesia-led, and then they moved over to more of a circulator-led timeout. And ours, there's a huge sign plastered over the wall where everybody can see the elements of the timeout, what we're supposed to include, and we also have little badges that go with our name badge, so you can flip through there and go through it. And it really does help you make sure that you're doing everything right. You're doing the timeout. And there's where I work now has a lot of buy-in and everybody participates, and that's good. But I've also worked elsewhere where there's just not buy-in. There's not participation. Surgeons are put out, I guess, maybe to have to stop to do a timeout. But I'm curious about your experience with the timeout. What has it been like for you where you've worked? The good, the bad, and anything in between, really.
Well, I can tell you I've definitely been that circulator chasing the surgeon down the hall. Where are you going? We're not done. And I've also been that circulator on the verge of tears, like, did he really just yell at me? I have to do this. So, yeah, the good news is in probably the last 7 to 8 years, I've seen a lot more participation, a lot more compliance, and OR personnel today just know we have to do this. And whether they're going to give me attitude about it or not, we're doing it.
And I think it's also important not just to have the surgeon buy-in, but everybody. Oftentimes when we'll witness a timeout that's just part of something you witness on survey, you'll have people with their backs turned, whether it's the surgical tech putting their back table together or it's the anesthesia provider doing their documentation. It's not just the surgeon.
No.
I think it's important to stress that it really is, it's about the whole team, everybody coming together and agreeing that we are doing the right case on the right person. I just think that that's critical to stress to everyone.
Yeah, it's
Absolutely.
cultural.
Yeah, that culture of safety in the facility is essential. The team needs to be able to feel safe enough to speak up if somebody's distracted, if somebody is not willing to participate in the timeout. So, absolutely.
Yeah, and you talk about distractions. There are oftentimes a lot of distractions going on in the OR. There's music playing oftentimes. We've got vendors coming in and out of the room. How do you limit that? What are your suggestions during that period of time for the timeout?
Well, for me, it's basically just calling out a timeout. I'll go to the music and turn it down, and I don't start until I have everybody's attention. And usually I get good compliance from everybody. But don't start the timeout until everybody is looking at you. That's key.
It makes me think of like when I was in school as a kid and all the kids are making noise and the teacher just stands there until the kids realize that the normal thing is not happening because everybody's not sitting in the right position to learn. And it's kind of the same thing. If everybody's not ready to do the timeout won't be done right. Yes,
absolutely. I used to work with a nurse that carried around a whistle. I don't know that she ever used it during a timeout, but she threatened to. Whatever it takes, right?
Well, you kind of just described a scenario when the rest of the team is not cooperating with the process. But Brenna, what are some other strategies that, and I don't want to just place this on leadership, because I know a lot of times people want to make leadership responsible, but that's a scapegoat, right? Mm-hmm. Leadership can't manage every little detail that's going on throughout the service. And so everybody has to be actively involved in that. And so even if you're not in a leadership or management position, what are some things that team members can do to make sure that there's an importance that's placed on the timeout without putting themselves in a bad position, and making sure that even if they're not a leader, that they're kind of acting like a leader and leading the team towards success for the patient?
Yeah, and the key word there is team, for sure. As if I'm trying to do a timeout and the anesthesia provider is noticing that I'm not getting anyone's attention, they'll step in and help as well. They'll call attention. Or the surgical technician will refuse to pass off the scalpel until the timeout's done. So it is a collaborative effort, and we all need to pay attention and work together to ensure participation. So I'm not in there alone.
Right.
Yes,
you're not in there
absolutely.
alone. So there's some gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And so if you're somebody who's not in the position of a gatekeeper, do you recommend creating a partnership and a collaboration with those gatekeepers? Because typically it's going to be the gatekeeper that does take it seriously. But if they feel like they're all alone, I don't want to say it's bullying. And we had a really excellent podcast on bullying, but they can get into a position where, well, it's not the culture and whatnot. So if you see the timeouts not happening, would you say that partnering with those gatekeepers and kind of rallying them so that you're on a team, like working together, and that they know that they're going to get supported if they use the gatekeeper position to not move forward without it?
Absolutely. That's an excellent point. And my buddy is always going to be my surgical tech. It can be somebody I've worked with for the last 5 years or a new face, and I will partner up with them, and we're going to tackle the day together, and we're going to get through all of it together. So I know that I can rely on my surgical tech to help me out if they can see that I'm in trouble, and vice versa.
Yeah, and I think there's some keys there that you mentioned, such as not handing off the scalpel, not putting the scalpel on the Mayo stand. There are some things that can be done that assist the circulator in that role, or the surgeon. I mean, surgeons sometimes lead our timeouts and they forget. So it is a team effort, and I do think there are some techniques there that you can utilize that are less aggressive, that might not put people in a bad position.
Mm-hmm. And giving everybody a part to play in that timeout makes a big difference.
Clarity of role.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think that's a really, really good piece to mention as well, because I think sometimes we leave out like our surgical techs and what their role in the timeout is.
Where I work, we have it broken down by role. The circulator starts it, and then he or she sends it off to anesthesia, and anesthesia has their part, and then the surgeon has his or her part. They have to say what they do, and then it goes to the surgical tech, and the surgical tech has to talk about the meds they have on their back table and whatever else that we have that's pertinent to the case, and then it comes back to the circulator again to finish it off. So everybody plays a part, which means everybody needs to be paying attention so they can hear when it's their turn to speak, so that everybody is included. And I think your part about us being a team, it just kind of helps make that cohesive team when we're working together and we're all being a part of it. But then we're doing this, and this is the role that we have, and these are the job that we do. But then we talked about leadership a minute ago. They do have to audit. They have to come by and check to make sure that we're doing it right. And I mean, everybody typically does it really, really right when the auditors come by. But how often should we be auditing our timeouts to make sure that everybody is doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Well, I think that we should be doing that pretty frequently. And I'll be honest, I don't see it done a lot. I worked in one facility where we were doing it once every 3 months. As the charge nurse, I was doing it. But where I'm currently at, nope. So that's definitely something that facilities need to be putting into their yearly plans.
What gets measured gets done. It's almost a cliched phrase at this point, but they are cliches because they're true. And if you measure it, there's also, if you're trying to make an improvement, you want to have measure points along the way. And so you can even throttle, I would think, your audits based on your performance with the audits. Doing something, anything without purpose or having some sort of action plan around that so that it maintains purpose, that's the cultural piece. That's all about getting that buy-in from everybody on the team. It's like, this is why we're doing it. And so if we do these audits and we continue to do very well with the audits, then we won't need to focus on improving. And it's all about reinforcement of behavior and identifying those areas for improvement.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention, Melanie kind of mentioned it earlier, you do oftentimes when you're auditing, you have a little bit of a Hawthorne effect where the auditor's present, we're going to do it right, but the minute the auditor steps out of the room, then we're going to go back to the way we did. One interesting way I've seen it done in the past is utilizing individuals that are less recognizable to do your audits, such as students, residents, having them conduct your timeout audits so you get a more accurate picture of what's really going on. Because if I step in a room as an OR director or as a surveyor, I know that timeout's going to happen just by the book. But when I walk out of the door, I don't know what's going to happen. So I've seen organizations that have put in effective internal audit programs where they've utilized individuals that might not be as recognizable, and they've gotten much more significant results.
I love that.
Yeah, meaningful data. That's excellent.
Yes.
That's a really good point, Jeremy. The only key to that is that you can't be penal with the results of that audit, or they'll feel like you sabotage them. It's almost like entrapment.
Agree with you 100%. And you mentioned it earlier, and I think it's the important piece of it. It's a quality improvement project. You don't want it to have a negative connotation at all. You want it, your quality improvement to be positive. And you can reinforce that by, setting goals and saying, hey, here's where we're at. This is where we want to be, and this is where we need to be. And by doing that, I think timeout auditing is a great quality improvement project for the OR.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
This has been a really great discussion. Brenna, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
As far as ensuring a collaborative effort with the team, I wanted to just touch base on consistency, just making sure that you're doing it the same way every time. And speaking for myself, that can be challenging because every surgeon has a different way of doing things. And Dr. So-and-so comes in and he's so laxed and you enjoy his room and it's so easy to not do the timeout the same you would in another surgeon's room. So keep it consistent to keep it accurate.
That is one of the best quotes I think I've ever heard. Keep it consistent to keep it accurate. Because, and I think it helps surgeons too, because, as circulators, we do have our faults, and sometimes we miss out on something. And if that surgeon's used to the way that timeout is done, then he can pick up on that real quick. And he say, well, you didn't ask me about blood products. So do we have any available? That consistency is important.
Yes. Yeah. And no matter how many timeouts we do in a lifetime, human error will always find a way in if given the opportunity. So we've just got to be on guard. So unfortunately, true. I worked in a facility where the timeout was done flawlessly. Everything was fine. And the surgeon looked down and still made incision on the wrong site. And the staff was baffled. We all talked about it for weeks. We just couldn't figure out how it happened. Everything was good. The surgeon confirmed the procedure. And how did he make incision on the wrong site? Luckily, the surgical tech was paying attention and stopped him before the incision got any bigger, but still, the incision was made on the wrong site.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you also have processes in place to identify sites that maybe you can't mark externally. You know, I've had the unfortunate experience of putting a stent in the wrong ureter, which is, I mean, it's the same as making the incision in the wrong side, even though, I mean, they did the timeout, but the surgeon went up the wrong ureter and placed the stent. So it's important that you also have steps in place for those sites that may not be easily identifiable when you're going to a common orifice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And most often seen with an armband where the site would be marked and initialed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Brenna, thank you so much for joining us. Fantastic interview. Great job. And keep up the good work. Maintain that consistency with your timeouts.
Thank you so much.
That was Brenna Page, and she is currently working in a surgery center in the Denver area. So, Jeremy, a very interesting discussion, and some of the things that really stuck out to me, a lot of it was around the documentation and the consistency. Like, there were just common themes throughout that conversation about how to make sure that we stop and have our pre-flight checklist completed so that we know that we've done everything within our power to ensure that this surgery goes off the way that it is supposed to. Because that whole story about making an incision and being on the wrong site, you can't take it back.
That's right. And you make a great example. Nobody wants to get on a plane where they don't use the pre-flight checklist. Nobody wants to go into surgery where a timeout's not done. And, you know, the thing about it is the patient doesn't get to witness it. It's one of the only times in the OR or in the hospital that a patient doesn't actively get to participate in their care. And it's our responsibility to be their advocate. And that timeout is just how we accomplish that in the OR, is being that patient's advocate, being that patient's voice. And that's why it's important. And I think that Brenna did a great job in describing what the elements of accurate timeout are and when they should occur in the OR.
Yeah, you know, it's like one of those things that might feel like it's mundane, but it's built in and should be baked in to what's happening every day. And it's the mundane nature of it that makes it so important because it has to be done regularly. So great job, Brenna. Thanks for taking a topic that seems, I don't want to say it's basic, but taking a topic that seems basic and really fleshing it out and talking about all the key ingredients for success with something that's essential to safe surgical care. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support First Case by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Jeremy, Melanie, and myself, thank you for listening to this episode of First Case.